Could show that a quorum of board members is present and that the meeting has been duly called and that notice of this meeting has been posted in accordance with Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to read this about open forum. The board welcomes and appreciates comments and input from the community. Open forum is provided at each meeting to allow the public to address the board. There will be one open forum tonight to hear requests regarding agenda items only. Those addressing the board are asked to limit their comments to 3 minutes. The speaker should identify his or her name, group affiliation if any, and make a brief presentation with an identified solution if one is sought. Remarks should be addressed to the board as a whole. Oral presentations may not include any charges against any employee or board member by name. It is my responsibility to determine if a person addressing the board has attempted to resolve the concern informally or through the district's complaint policies. If not, the speaker will be directed to follow the appropriate policy. The board requests that all presentations be made in a courteous, respectful, and professional manner and asks that all speakers monitor their own behavior. If you wish to speak during the open forum, please fill out one of the cards located in the table at the entry hall. Mr. Chapman, any comments?
Yes, I do have a couple of items. First of all, in your packet this evening, you have the COVID report. You have two reports. One represents the COVID reported cases as of 12 p.m. today, so that would include those cases for Saturday, Sunday, and then up through noon today. And then you also have included the COVID report for 9/27 through 10/3. So those had been requested, and so that information is being provided to you this evening. Additionally, you have information which includes an update on the May 2018 bond projects. We did have a request for that information as well. Specifically, the request had to do with where we were on the technology projects. So we were able to actually just give you all of these projects. So thought that would be good to just give you an update on everything. So it starts with the beginning project budget, any amendments we made to that budget, and then you're able to see the receipts for each one of the years going out as the bond was being implemented. And then you get to total receipts and then actual budget looking at, is there any money that's left over from that particular project? And so we wanted to provide that information to you this evening. So I find that helpful.
All right, thank you. Were there any other clarifications needed?
There were not. I've got some information for you in closed session.
Okay. All right, we will not be going, actually, open forum, nothing? Okay. We will not need a closed session at the beginning of the meeting tonight, so we'll move on to review board agenda items, quarterly investment report for the quarter ending August 2021. Mr. Williams.
Good evening. As required by Government Code 2256, which is the Public Funds Investment Act, present to you the quarterly investment report for the quarter ending August of 2021. The report shows the beginning ending balances and interest we've earned during the period, as well as the investments, what we have invested in. And I'll be happy to entertain any questions if you have any.
Are there any questions on this report? All right, not hearing any, we'll move on to budget transfer and amendment request for October 2021.
Okay, the budget transfer and amendment request is fairly light this month. We've got a couple of, one for about $20,000 and one request for $1,600, I believe. And I would be happy to entertain any questions on that.
Any questions about the transfer request? All right, item 6.03, network switch replacements.
This is a request from the technology department to purchase a network switch replacement. It is being, let me find it, hold on. Skipped over it. There we go. The vast majority of that, $413,810, is being reimbursed through E-rate. but $124,869 of that will be the district's responsibility. That will come from the technology bond budget, so.
Okay, any questions on that? All right, reports and presentations. Disbursements for the month of September.
The disbursement report for the month of September is there for review, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions on that.
Any questions on disbursements? All right. Measures of academic progress. Dr. Norgard.
May have been a misleading setup so far. I'm not sure I can do my report quite that quickly, but I will try to be cognizant of your time. I am excited to bring you your first leading data analysis report of the 21-22 school year, and this is in fact a new assessment. So I won't do this every time I bring map data to you, but for this first one, I do have some slides in here that you may have already seen explaining a little bit about the test itself, because it is a different kind of test than some of the other tests we report on. So I want to be sure that that understanding is clear, because otherwise when you just look at the numbers, it would be easy to draw some false conclusions. So I wanted to take some time this first time to tell you about the test. So MAP, or MAP growth, is the full name of the test. We're going to be administering 3 times during the school year for 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade in reading and math. Here's the major difference. This is not about mastery of content. We are not looking for the percent correct. We are looking for the appropriate instructional level. Where do I start intervention? Where do I begin enrichment? So that's a little bit of a different thinking, and I'm going to show you how we reach those levels and then what teachers can do with that information. So the MAP growth test is administered on a device. Each one of our students are on their Chromebooks. And unlike a CBA that I've passed out and you all have the same 20 questions, and that's your whole possibility of scores. You either get 0 or you get 100% correct. This test is going to move students based on how they're answering. So for example, if it's a 4th grade class, everyone may begin the test with a 4th grade leveled question, but depending on how you each individually answer that question, it's either then gonna bump you up and your next question's a little harder because you got that right. We've got to challenge you a little more. Or if a student out of the block got that first question wrong, it's gonna back them down to a slightly easier question. So you can see as this kind of moves along that where it's going up, and then when I finally hit a wrong question, it's going to come back down, and then it goes back up, green getting correct, until it eventually almost just starts to hover back and forth, because the goal of the computer adaptive testing is really to hit approximately 50% correct. Now see, if we reported on other tests, our students are scoring anywhere from 0 to 100% correct. Virtually every student is hitting 50% correct on the questions they're answering. It's then what that score gives us that we move forward. So you can also see the whiskers on each of these questions that if you look at the key down there, it says standard error. I might end up, after I've administered all the questions, ending up right on the same instructional level of that first question. But the more questions I've asked, you see how those whiskers get shorter, means less error. I can say with more confidence, if I only gave you one question and you got it right, I said, oh, you're good to go. That's not enough information. So that's what this test is doing. So this value that we end up with through this process is also called the zone of proximal development. The reason it's important for that 50-50, a student has enough knowledge to start hooking and building new knowledge. They're not completely, I have no idea what my teacher is talking about. They have some knowledge at that level, but they haven't already mastered it. So it's that instructional zone. That's where that teacher comes in and can push from that level and move them forward. So at the end of this, if we're not going to look at and say, well, every student got 50% correct, we're really going to look and see what RIT value went with that particular student's 50% correct level. RIT stands for Rosh unit. It's not exactly an acronym, it's just squished together, Rosh unit. I promise to never quiz you or ask you that term again. RIT is fine. And you can see, I actually borrowed this graphic from the map testing company. NWEA is the publisher. And you see that the test is actually available kinder through 12th grade. We're focusing, this is our first time using the test, we're focusing 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, reading math. But it's available across. And the same interval score the same RIT scale goes all the way across kinder through 12th grade. So a student could, if they were taking this every year, you could watch how their RIT score improves year to year to year. But that also means that I might have two students, I might have a 4th grader and a 6th grader that had the exact same RIT. They're performing at the same instructional level. So is that an advanced 4th grader that's performing like a 6th grader? Is a 6th grader that's struggling and performing like 4th? Are they meeting in the middle at 5th? That's where I have to go to the next piece of information, our norms that tell us, okay, so based on that RIT score, where should it be? What would be normal for that grade level at that time? And NWEA has published national norms. These are developed on, depending on the grade and subject, anywhere from 3.6 million to 5.5 million tests. Very large sample that these norms were developed around. And you can see across the top of the line, so imagine that number line are some RIT scores that are available. I included the grades that we're using for the test, and this is an example with the reading norms for what you would expect in fall. That's where you would say a typical 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grader would be. You see, I added some additional measures underneath because we don't expect, if I'm starting here when I hit 3rd grade by winter or spring, I should have moved, I should have progressed. But what's interesting is when you look at the colors like the red spring, the 3rd grade spring norm is actually just ever so slightly ahead of that 4th grade fall norm. We've spent many discussions talking about summer slide. You see that in nationally normed data. That is not a unique HEB characteristic. So that's where you can actually see in this test. But in addition to those arrows I just dropped down, that's the mean, that's the average performance in each of those grades for fall. But not every student scores exactly the same. Some scored above the mean, some scored below the mean. So it happens in whatever term you want to call this that makes sense to you, your normal distribution, your bell curve, your standard distribution, all of these things. So here's where you could really see how a 3rd and a 5th grader might get the same RIT score, because you see how far out the scores can move from that mean. So, yes, ma'am. This particular illustration, I just did those colors. Yes, because we're going to get into some colors later. This was just, I wanted to let you see the grades were separate. So now, since you said that, imagine that little green curve. We're going to expand it out more fully. So here's a little more detail about what might be happening in 4th grade, because I mentioned this is not about percent correct. Percentile, very similar, but a different statistical measure that we're talking about. Percentile tells me a student at the 84th percentile is performing better than 84% of his or her peers. Okay, I can find percentiles by using that normal curve. If I know where the mean is, that's right at that 50th percentile, half above and half below that score point. But also standard deviation, fancy statistical term, it's just the key word there is deviation. How much does it spread out? How much does it deviate? So by using all of those measures, I can now say for a student on 4th grade reading fall score of 213 RIT, they're at the 84th percentile. So that's where we get that percentile number. So 50, if you're used to thinking 50% correct and going, oh no, I'm a little concerned for that child. 50th percentile means right on the average. Okay, so that's just an important distinction. So once we have these RIT scores and percentile numbers, there are lots of sources of reports that building principals can use with campus or grade level reports and that classroom teachers can use. While this is a district report, so I'm going to focus on district level data, I did for the first time in this test want you to see just some few snips of the kinds of things that teachers are able to do in moving students based on this information. So this is that big snapshot view. And you'll see right here, so here's where there are colors that are going to mean something. We're going to carry these colors forward, this red, orange, yellow, green, blue, because those are those percentile bands. And in fact, you'll see these middle, the orange, yellow, and green, low average, average, high average. All of that is considered average performance. It may not be exactly that 50th percentile average, but that's where we would expect normal students to fall, and then we can look at the high and the low. Beyond that, that was that big view. Here's a very detailed view. This could be a teacher's class. And beyond just knowing their reading RIT score, you'll see that actually there are reports that break it down, not just reading, but by instructional area. I can tell for these students, where's their vocabulary? How are they understanding multiple genres? Where are they with author's purpose and craft? And this helps me think about strategy groups. Which group of students need more help in which areas? And I can see them coming together. You may be wondering, that's very tiny font. I saw many of you lean into your screen because it is very tiny. But it's possible, like if you look down in this right corner, all of those students have a 243 behind their name. That means their overall writ in reading in this example was a 243. But if you look up to the chart, they were falling in 3 different performance bands when you look specifically at author's purpose and craft. Does that make sense? So I can now see some relative strengths and weaknesses. And for example, the student Flores out here is really outperforming in author's purpose and craft. Ready for some extension, or is there another area where that student may need some more support? Beyond that, that was a reading example. Here's a math that will take me. So now that helped me group students and say this group of students is performing at this same instructional level. Well, what should that instruction look like? Here's another example of a report. You see that same information that was in that matrice. This would now be like from one little cell. Here's the students' names, their overall writ. But if they're performing at this writ with whole number and decimal computations, these are the kind of skills that I need to be looking at and seeing where are they ready and targeting. So I've got by the teaks there.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
If I'm a principal and I'll give a test, and in every class there's kids with different written scores.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't I take the ones on this level and put them with one teacher and this level with another teacher? Therefore, they can use the same strategies to move that group forward instead of having different groups in the
Okay.
same class.
We do at elementary when we get into intervention and support time for those specific pull-out times, or we call it Stripe in our K2 grades and Safari at 3-6. They actually will mix students for those strategy groups among different teachers.
It's not like you do that at the beginning of the year. You could take the higher writ scores higher and raise the lower writ scores higher.
Maybe it comes down to, there's the overall writ and then there's within each area. Like speaking from math, if somebody's really strong in geometry, but not in numerical operations, we can't say just based on that overall writ that all the students need the same thing. They have relative strengths and weaknesses within there. So that's why it gets down to, it's not about my whole group instruction, it's about when I'm either pulling a group for intervention or enrichment. Because we also need to have our eyes on those high performing and how do I push them further. So it really, those kinds of differentiations happen during a time when I'm not teaching to 22 students.
I'm a secondary person and I don't get elementary.
Well, right now, we're just testing at elementary. Yeah, I agree. But does that make sense?
Well, in elementary, it does.
Okay. Well, right now, we're only using it in 3rd through 6th grade. So it is available.
I'm a secondary person.
Okay.
It's sometimes easy to do.
Okay, so here is something that will look more like what you're used to me seeing with data. So while I did all of this convincing to you that this was a norm reference test, it's percentiles. However, there are studies that the publisher has done to link, to correlate how does performance on MAP project and connect to proficiency on STAR tests. Okay, so there are different studies that they have, over several years, developed these projected proficiencies. So based on their performance on MAP, we can see, this is a sample data class, I can see which students, based on how they did at the fall, would be projected to not meet for math, the ones that were going to hit approaches, the ones that would hit meets, and masters. Now that's just for the particular administration. So let's say this is for fall. This first student here in the approaches, E. Lloyd, I don't know if it's Elliot or Elizabeth or who that might be, but their RIT score of 211 in the fall of that year projects them to be approaches when they hit their math star in the spring. They can't sit at 211 all year. That is assuming they're going to get average growth, that they're going to keep moving through the year. So teachers are certainly going to keep their eye on that student and be sure, is that student still at approaches, or hey, have I pushed them further? Did I accelerate their growth? And now that student is more on track to be meets.
All right, so just to clarify, this give the test in the fall, you have that number, you add average growth, and that's where they project to be in the.
You don't
when you
just
get the
add
start.
average, right now, this is just, I'm sorry, yes, to get this projection in their correlation study, it would be presuming average growth. But we will get an actual growth measure on each student the second time we give a test. This first time, all we get is achievement. Then we have to give it again to say, now here's achievement and here's your growth.
Yeah, and a lot of times that's the most important number, is how much are the kids
Exactly,
growing from one to another.
especially as we're looking at this situation is, how am I moving our students, getting at least average growth and accelerating everywhere I can and extending? I'll come again to that high end of the spectrum because when we sit and look, we have a lot of students that, sit through their CBAs or DBAs and make perfect scores. Well, where did they grow? They went from 100% to 100%. With MAP, we can see growth for our high achieving students as well because it doesn't have a ceiling. It'll keep pushing them till they get that 50-50, which is a challenge for some GT students. They don't like tests where they're not getting all the answers correct.
So Holly, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So since we do have the linking study, which links to the proficiency on STAR, I know it's not the intention of the MAP test to be utilized like a criterion reference test for those kiddos who did not necessarily take the test last year, but we're looking for some type of assessment to determine if they need to continue on with intervention or if they can test out. Since there is this linking study, are we able to use the linking study and use this test for that purpose?
We can use this right now as we were just actually working through our 45-45, some additional criteria. We can also use RIT performance for that as well. So there's a
Okay.
number of ways these measures
Okay,
could
so
be
this
used.
actually can be used for 45-45. I know initially
can.
that wasn't the intent, but we have found a way to be able to use it. And they don't have to actually set through a second testing.
That's correct, yes. We were able to use MAP for these students in these grades that we had that value. So just to show you, this is even more, this is just a sampling. These are down to student level reports. And again, the more times we give it, the more bars pop into those graphs because we can really watch a student over time as they've grown. Information for the family as well. And this is the last report I want to show you because it's one I think is very powerful. And if you recall your ERG reports, when we've looked at those, it may look very familiar. This is a static picture, but if this was live interaction for the teacher, for example, she's hovered over this student and that student's detail pops up. So these represent, right now, we've only given the test once, so we have achievement on a percentile. So anything above the 50th percentile, this would be above average achievement, below average. When we get to the mid-year, we will have for every student not just achievement, but growth as well. Now, I want to point out, notice that this axis, again, the font is tiny, but it says growth percentile. Same thing, same idea about this norming, and we're looking at how did they grow compared to their peers. So it's not, I grew 3 points, I grew 10 points. It's how did your growth compare to normal growth? So that, I think, is maybe even trickier than achievement. Thinking of percentile is 50th percentile growth is average growth. But what we want is to accelerate that growth. We want to be above that line because if I'm here and my peers are all performing here and we all grow at the same rate, I'm still below them. Right. So we need to accelerate that growth. And something else to also keep our eye on as we continue to refine with our high achieving students as well. This is a test that I just said there is room for them to grow. We can't just say, oh, they've been doing just fine, they're getting everything right. Let's be sure that we are looking at that growth for all of our students, whatever their current instructional level is.
So to clarify again, the percentiles that we're talking about and the growth that we're talking about, that's based off of the national norms, not off of other HEB students. So we're not comparing a kid's percentile amongst their peers in HEB or in
Well,
the
at
state
the
of Texas.
campus level report, there are campus level norms, but every time, speaking statistically, the more data points you have, the better your norms are, the stronger they are. If you're trying to norm within a class of 22 students, it's a little harder to get that accurately. I would like to point out that the most recent norming study, they released new norms in 2020 for NWEA, but that norming study was done from 2015 to 2018. So where I'm about to show you where our students fell on the norms, that is comparing our current performance to pre-pandemic norms.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's important, I think, to understand that this is where performance was. They collected 3 years of data for each norming study, but then it takes time to crunch all of that. That's why they were published in 2020, but it was actually collected up through 2018, so pre-pandemic norms.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that, because usually when we're talking about this kind of data, we're talking about how did students in HEB do and what percentage hit this number.
And-
But this is a completely different way. This is more like looking at SAT scores or college entrance scores.
Yes and no. Right now, absolutely, because we have a single data point on all of our students. As we continue to give it year after year, I can talk about this year's third graders compared to last year's third graders. But right now, we've got one data set for HEB students because we've administered it one time to these four, in these two testing areas in these 4 grades. So does that?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify what our pool of students is. It's not just HEB, it's
Yes, the
national.
norming sample is set up, they are national norms. Okay, any other questions about the test before I jump into the results? So because there are so many ways you could look at this data, I really looked at what would be, I hope, the best representation for you that, again, we could watch over time as we move from beginning of year to middle of year to end of year to capture that snapshot. Because, again, at the district, we're looking at that big picture, but I've shown you all those tools that teachers have on campus to really dig down for each student level, or that a principal is looking within their campus at a grade level. So I have represented our percentile bands for you. Now, here's where you really have to separate both things. The bands are percentiles. Those color numbers at the bottom, I am telling you what % of our students fell in that band. That makes sense? It's because you got both going on. But neither one is % correct. Percentiles and the % of our students falling into those bands. So the more we have towards the right side, the better. And I added the little bar for a visual, for those that are visual like myself. So I thought you would be interested in that. I just drew the percentages for our combined. We do have MAP available in both English and Spanish, but just as we do with CBAs and DBAs, I don't care if they test in English or Spanish. I need all of my students to be performing. So I just carried the percents through for the combined. And I knew you would want to see projected STAR proficiency. Those starred numbers, as I used to use in the other charts, those are the performance objectives reports targets. And you will see a theme that we tend to be close, or in some cases exceeding right now at approaches. It's meets and masters where we're seeing more of that difference. Okay, so this is for third grade. I did drop the week 4. This test was administered in the 4th week of school, just so that as we move through, if that helps you see kind of where we are. It's my first report. If you don't find that helpful, I'm certainly open to that feedback. Okay, so all the rest will look like this. Here is our 4th grade math. Again, we do have more of our scores towards the blue end of the rainbow, less, 15% of our kids that are in the lower percentiles. Projected STAR proficiency, really close right there at approaches, but we see bigger separations at meets and masters. 5th grade math, we have a few more, but still about what you would expect in a normal distribution at low. Projected STAR proficiency as of beginning of year. 6th grade math, we're no longer testing in English and Spanish, it's all English. And our projected STAR proficiency. 3rd grade reading. So we see some very strong on the high end with our reading. STAR proficiency, I want to point out, I mentioned that they use lots and lots of data points. The projected STAR proficiency in math, that was counting for both our English and Spanish testers. STAR math is a straight translation. The English and Spanish are exactly the same problems. English reading and Spanish reading STAR are not identical. You can't just take a reading passage and translate it into Spanish and say that's the same readability level. So because it's a separate test, and fewer students testing in Spanish, it's going to take them longer before they have a robust enough data to say, we feel strongly these are the projections. So on the reading side, we have all the RIT data, everything else from MAP for those students. It's just the projected STAR proficiency study that is not yet completed from NWEA. So, but you can see we're right there at approaches and actually above the mark currently at meets. This, I think, again, speaks to what we've talked about, math and science, not having those hands-on opportunities saw a bigger slide than our reading. Fourth grade reading, well above the target at approaches and right on for meets. Fifth grade reading, not quite there, but close at approaches. And sixth grade reading, again, only testing in English, and the STAR proficiency there. So, questions?
I have a question. How many total tests will elementary kids take now?
In all subjects,
If I'm in third grade, how many tests do I take in that year?
you, like including a CBA, a DBA?
Then you got STAR, then you got this.
Okay, a third grader would take MAP in reading and math, beginning of year, middle of year, end of year. That's done within an instructional class period. That's not like a shutdown, like a
So that's 3.
STAR test. They would do it in reading and math, so that's 6. They would have a DBA for reading. They would have a CBA essay, because now that writing is not a separate test, they're going to have a writing CBA. They would have 2 CBAs, Ms. Adcox in math, and 2 DBAs, one that's a partial, and science CBAs, 2 or 3. I'd have to look at our full assessment calendar. So everything other than a DBA is part of their instructional time period. It's part of whatever subject it is. If it's a math CBA, it's happening during the math instructional time. And as you guys have heard me say many times, if we're taking instructional time to give the assessment, it's because we've got to change our instruction based on that assessment. We're looking for where do we move that instruction. Only the DBAs are where we basically have a shutdown and we stop and kind of simulate the STAR testing experience. So everything else is like a subject area test. It's given within that time period.
Yes, I agree that it's a lot of tests, but the amount of information that a teacher gets from having this is, yeah.
And we're already finding it is a new assessment, but Mrs. Adcox, our elementary math coordinator, is here, and she's been out with several campuses that have already found amazing ways, and they're looking at, this is a layering of data points, because we just gave that first math CBA. Okay, well, what did MAP tell me? And if they're a 4th, 5th, or 6th grader, I also have their STAR from last year. And so it also helps us look, where is everything in line? But it is a slightly different piece of information than what I would get from a CBA or DBA, because again, if a student only gets 20% correct on a CBA, I'm like, I'm not sure, was that guessing, what was it, versus if on this test, it's gonna keep backing them up until they're hitting that 50% mark of correct or incorrect. So I have a much better idea of the instructional level for that student than the CBA alone. But our STAR is that percent correct model, that criterion reference. So those have a place too in helping us project.
It really allows you to be much more efficient and effective in your instruction, especially in your differentiation. Because I think too often it's the shotgun approach. You know, I think this is what the kids need, so everybody's going to get this. Now I can look at this data because it's part of assessment. I mean, it's part of instruction. If I really trace back to the instruction, I differentiate my instruction based on this assessment. I'm much more efficient, because one of the things we know that we're trying to move kids forward at the same time we're trying to close the gap. So every minute we have has to be efficient and effective in remediating those gaps.
The table that I showed you that had the different instructional areas compared to their overall, I think is why that's so powerful, because sometimes in the absence of that kind of detail, we would just say, oh, that's a high-performing student. They don't need this support. And it may be that they're really high performing in 2 of the 3 areas that I was looking at in that test. And so it's almost masking. I'm missing this opportunity where they needed support because I only looked at that overall.
And I think the other thing it does for the really high achieving student, it removes the ceiling. And too often, when you were just looking at STAR scores or you were looking at some other assessments, there was a ceiling that was there, and often teachers, and I'm not knocking teachers, all of us you would look at that and say, hey, this kid's really performing at the top. But, so we would move on to help, to look at other kids who needed help versus how do I extend this kid to continue to move that kid forward and not hit that ceiling academically.
Yeah, because our goal was this, let's get them all up to here, and now it's like, no, let's get everybody up like this.
I have a question. So this says week 4 for beginning of year. When are the other points taken?
We will be assessing again in December, and I believe it is week 18. I will have that for you when I bring it. And then the final one, we give them a window in May. So, and the norms, when we enter that in to NWEA's website where they generate all the reports, we can put exactly, we're in this week of the school year, they've had this many weeks of instruction, and it adjusts those norms. Again, because the sample is so large, they took into, when they did their norming study, they took from every school district that administered it, how many weeks were you in? When you call it fall, because fall could be a lot of different things, a lot of different places. So it was actually based on how many weeks into instruction that it was given. So that also will help us a little bit. I know some of the things you've asked sometimes is when I bring, because I always have the date given for DBA reports, and we're like, wait, why did that move? Why didn't we give the test at the same time? And it's like, well, but this happened, or the holiday fell here. By being able to do that, we'll be able to hopefully track or at least see the norms are going to adjust based on what week in the school year it is.
Okay, the thing that bothers me, and I agree with what you're doing, and the information's great, but when you have a parents conference and you're discussing the MAP scores, or the DBAs, I think in a matter of time, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 years, more and more parents are gonna understand that to tell their kids, when you take that MAP test, you need to know how important it is, because it's gonna depend on the strategies used in your teaching. So I wanna hear from Darla on what she had since elementary, adding more tests and more pressure to elementary kids, does that make any difference?
Does it make
You wanna
any
go to the
difference?
microphone, talk?
Do you want me to?
No, you're fine right there. I can hear you. I don't
All right.
Come for the benefit of our audience
Okay.
that's online.
And they might not have heard this question.
I'm not sure I understand the
And,
question.
and the reason I ask that is because in the past years, of all my years, on the STAR test and stuff, I've heard from so many elementary parents that their kid throws up every morning before taking the STAR test. And so now we're adding more tests, and now, do you say don't worry about them, do you emphasize them, and how long do the kids go, oh, I gotta go do good on this one, I have to do good at this one, now I got another one. And now we're adding 3 more. I think it's wonderful high school. I wish I would have had it back when I was there, but I worry about those elementary kids, of all the stories I've heard in the past 10 years about testing, and, they get scared to death and can't sleep, how elementary kids are. So I wanted you to tell me how you feel about adding 3 tests to the elementary kids.
Well, I look at it differently than STAR. I know kids get really stressed out, and some kids get stressed out for any test, but I think, like Holly was describing with our CBAs and our DBAs, those are taken, well, DBAs have shut down, but the CBAs are taken in their regular class period, and so is this. So I don't think and I think it's also important the way that we present it to kids, because at elementary school, they go off of us. I say us, the teachers, the principals, exactly. I don't think it has the same, if you're asking my personal opinion, a test like this as compared to a STAR test. Everybody knows about STAR. It's in the news. Everybody talks about it. It's, even though we try to minimize that pressure that's there for our elementary students, none of us want our kids to feel stressed out and pressured over any test. But I personally don't think the MAP test is the same. Will have the same, they take it during their class period. Now, it was new this fall. I think for kids, it's a different set of test taking. They're used to trying all their strategies, right, on a STAR test. And it kind of maxes out, right? Like Holly was explaining, you can get anywhere from between a 0 and 100. This is different. It's going to keep pushing them until it might get too hard for them. So I think the conversation has to be a little bit different with kids on taking a MAP test versus taking a STAR test or a DBA test. But
I just wanted to hear from you.
yeah, I certainly hope it doesn't cause stress. We don't want it to, of course. Nobody does. We don't want STAR to. We know it does with some students. But again, I think that's our job to try to minimize that as much as we can, and still get kids to do their best. So it's a tricky thing, but
I wanted, if they get calls now, they know what to say.
sure.
So,
Okay.
so I have a follow-up question from the other side, Darla, Holly. So I've never been a teacher, so I don't understand. So I'm a teacher now. I have my classroom snapshot of these. What does this give me as the teacher, in real simple terms, to help that we didn't have before?
You wanna take that?
I don't know that I'll back all the way up to those slides, but some of those reports where I can now look and say, okay, before when I would have that small group time that is built into their instructional day of this is my small group time for reading, and I might have been basing who I'm going to pull more like on an overall performance. You know, these are the students that struggle in my class, so I'm going to pull them together. Now I'm looking and saying, if I'm working on this skill, these are the students I need, but tomorrow it may be different. Now, there are some children that will show up on my list every day because they do struggle in every area, but it helps me know that when I get to that small group instruction where I really can focus on just this small group of children in front of me, that I'm focusing on the right things for them, that I'm not casting my net too wide.
What's the average time that one of these tests takes?
So that is some feedback we got from teachers because it's a different style of testing. It should take about 45 minutes, which would be roughly half or less of their instructional block, because third grade and up, we have 90 minutes more on the ELA side. But some of our students did, because it was kind of hard for them, especially those GT students that don't ever like to get anything wrong, to, I got it. If you just let me stick with this problem, I can do it. And so some of them did take longer. That's in another report, actually. It shows for the teachers how long each student took. It can give you an average per problem. It has a random guessing feature if they answer too many too quickly, inaccurately, versus a student that's answering quickly and getting them correct. I mean, that's what I showed you, a small snippet of the data, but short answer is it should take 45 minutes. We did take longer this first time, was feedback that we heard from teachers, because it is that different kind of mindset of, this is not a spend 10 minutes on a question. If it's, understand that you're gonna miss half of them. You're gonna see things that are too hard for you. It's okay to say, I think it's this, and you move on.
Yeah, it seems like the higher the RIT, the longer the test would take to get there, but not necessarily, I
Well,
guess.
also,
depending on
now
how
that we
quickly they
have
answer
the
your question.
first score, because it started them all at the middle of what was the expected grade level, it's got their fall RIT score. It's gonna start their mid-year RIT based on where you would think growth would put them. So that hopefully we're coming in at just that sweet spot. Again, it's gonna have to go up and down until it stabilizes, because that's what's gonna reduce the error. But I'm starting, every student is starting at a different spot in mid-year. And in fact, if we carry this over, then even where you left third grade may determine what you're gonna see first for fourth grade in the fall. So some of those will, as we have more history with this assessment, will streamline some of those processes.
Holly, I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
I think there's been a great interest in the impact of COVID and where that has left us. You know, for these third graders, there are some of these third graders who this would have been the very first time they ever tested for us. Right. Because if they were either weren't with us or didn't come take the STAR in the spring, and they didn't get it in 2020, we may not have a great grasp of where they are. So this is the first foray into really getting to know where they are. And I'm looking at the stars where you have, our projected STAR proficiency and our goals.
Mm-hmm.
where are those numbers coming from, and how recently have they been
Okay.
revised?
The goals are from our performance objectives report, which we update every year. And what it is, I am reporting only district level goals. We actually have those kind of goals for every demographic, subgroup, et cetera. And the general premise with the setting of the performance objectives is 3 points above prior performance. But when I start looking at those other breakdowns of student groups, if I ever want to close a gap, same idea of we can't all keep moving at the same rate. So for some subgroups, it may be a subgroup needs a 4-point gain, 5-point gain, or if they were already seriously outperforming other subgroups, maybe 2 points at a time will get them where they need to be. But I'm reporting district, so what you're seeing in those is a goal that's 3 points higher than last year's actual performance.
And that's exactly what my question was, because I saw that, yet our numbers right now are lagging behind that we're not necessarily 3 points behind our goal to say we are where we were last year. We're actually below that. So does this, drawing conclusions from this test, does this tell us where we are? We actually are a little bit more behind and have more room to make up to get to where we need to be?
We know that we have room to make up, but two different things are happening in the data. I mentioned that this was normed to pre-COVID standards. So where my RIT is falling, the RIT score is based on pre-COVID standards, so it might look lower because this was a gap year. But now the projected proficiency, remember that's a different study. I said it's a linking study, so it's now taking a lower RIT and trying to project to a star that's not, does that make sense? That's not necessarily from the lower point, because they're two different studies. And the star does adjust the passing standards. The scale scores are frozen, but the average percent correct to achieve each of those thresholds can change. So those may also be sliding this year. So those were static studies in the norming data, and so all of those factors could intervene, but it should be pretty accurate when you look at the big scheme of how all of those pieces are moving together. It means we've got some growth to make up. However, this will also be when we get to mid-year, the first time we'll see the growth measure in this chart, which will have been normed to a normal year of growth. So we want to see bigger than average growth so that we can catch those points.
All right, any more questions? All right, I mean, I personally.
Not quite as quick as finance.
No, I'll get to, that's good. Yeah, so the, I mean, these types of computer adaptive tests, they've been around for a while. I mean, I remember taking, the first one I ever took was when I was taking my GMAT to get into business school. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of such a thing. And you can only do it on a computer. And I think long-term, people are always talking about what's after STAR. And I think this is gonna be what comes after STAR, is these types of tests that you take at various times through the year. Maybe some of them count, maybe some of them don't. Parents, teachers, students don't know which ones count, which ones don't. Hopefully that takes care of some of the anxiety. Maybe it makes it worse, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think this is kind of the future of assessment testing, and I'm glad that we're getting ahead of it and kind of learning what it all means, because it is a new vocabulary for this board and it's a new way of looking at it. But to me personally, it makes a lot of sense to really target in as to where every student is, instead of just, you made a 40 on this test or you made a 60 on this test. So I appreciate it, and never feel like you need to apologize for taking a lot of our time. I mean, I know Dobie doesn't mind when we go through his stuff fast, and we're really here to talk about students and talk about student achievement. So we appreciate all your work on this. All right. Let's see, we are down into other business. Is there any board member who wish to request something be placed on a future board agenda? All right, board activity chart, is that? We're looking good. We're looking good? All right, Mr. Brown says we're covered. Hasn't gotten that far yet. All right. I mean, it looks like everything over the next couple weeks is covered, so. All right, now we're down to talk to approval of Tarrant Appraisal District nominees, nomination of candidates.
Now, do we have
We do
So-
not. This is not voting on the
So-
candidates. This is nominating candidates. So
Let me clarify for those
I'll
that,
let Fred run this for a minute.
okay. Okay, so I'm very excited because HEB has not participated in this part of it. In December, we will actually take the votes for those that are in it. Of the 42 entities, there is only a handful of entities that actually nominate. And when they nominate, it becomes part of the ballot, and then that becomes to us. If you guys will remember, in 2019, we really put our weight, we added 2 new members to the TAD board. And I think, without having to get into the review of where we're putting our votes and everything else, we'll do that in December. But the 2 candidates that we were really focusing on actually got and won the election. And ironically, they are still on the TAD board. I say that because the TAD has also had a bunch of changes since then. So that would be Gary Lasad and Rich Diot.
Are they up for reelection?
They are,
Is that what you're saying?
correct.
Okay.
Correct. So they need to be nominated first.
Gotcha.
And the nominations will not only come from HEB, some of the other 42 entities may nominate them as well. But since they were the 2 candidates that we were focused on in 2019, and since they are still on the board and interested in running again,
And do we know how they did? Did they do a good job?
I've been following it very closely, and I'm actually in fairly good conversations with these 2, and I thought they did an excellent job and made some changes. But more of that discussion we can talk about when we review them in December.
Okay. But we have to nominate somebody now.
Correct. And I would recommend that we nominate the same 2.
Okay.
I think, just for a point of clarification, we don't have to nominate anybody, but you're suggesting that we do this time.
That's correct. And let me add to Ms. Cole's point. 5 or 6 entities of the 42 are the only ones that do any nominating. And yes, we don't have to do anything. And I want to clarify, just because we nominate these 2 doesn't necessarily mean that we will cast our votes for these 2. But it is a reassurance, Ms. Cole, that we think that they're doing a good job. And it is part of the process that I would like us to participate in going
And
forward.
I do see that it says may nominate, so that makes sense. Okay. But does anybody else know other people that we could nominate to get up to 5 candidates to be nominated?
You're allowed to nominate up to 5 candidates. Very few entities usually nominate more than a couple.
Okay.
Again, I had lunch and interviewed a potential candidate, but it's not one that we've done before, and I would like that process to maybe be in a committee or have discussion of resumes, which we'll do in December.
And the deadline to nominate is
Is
by the
October 15th, which is why we're discussing it today.
Okay. Okay. So I'll make a motion.
Okay. Okay. I move that HEBISD School Board nominate Gary Lasada and Rich Diot for the TAD Board.
For 2022, 2023.
Correct.
You read it as it says.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. I move that the board approves the resolution to nominate Gary Lasad and Rich Diot to serve on the Tarrant County Appraisal District Board for 2022, 2023.
Oh, second. Sorry.
I have a motion and a second that the board approves the resolution to nominate
Gary
Gary
Lasad,
Lasad and
Rich Diot.
Rich Diotate to serve on the Tarrant Appraisal Board for 2022, 2023. Please vote. And that motion passes.
Can I make one comment? Normally, the board secretary would type that up and send that out prior to October 15th.
We already have the form.
Awesome.
We already have the form. We just need to fill it out, and I can sign it, but she won't be back for a little
But I
while,
was-
so. Yeah, before the 15th, she should be back.
Perfect.
All right, so at this time, the board is going to go into closed session pursuant to Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Section 551.071 to 551.074.